when you think about plants, let's say in the nursery from your experience there, there's an immense amount of technology in modern nursery operations from seeding to potting up, all sorts of equipment. Do you think our understanding of what you just mentioned, plants, not basic physiology, we know if you plant a seed, hey, it's going to sprout cotyledons, then true leaves, and it grows. But are we operating on a higher knowledge base in terms of the exact right media for the exact crop with the exact right fertility and the exact right water? Are we there yet with technology compared to where we were, say, 50 or 100 years ago? Or are we still kind of doing the same thing just with modern tools?
That's a really good question. I would say we've come far. I do believe we've come very far, and there's a lot that we understand. However, there are times where I believe it becomes very inefficient commercially to dwell on some questions and over ask them. You have to move forward. You have to grow your crop. You have to pick something and go. And so I think there is so much room for improvement, whether it is the timing of how we deliver nutrients or maybe very specific blends of components in a substrate as we maximize porosity of it might be choosing between different components and even container size or shape, and how we supply the water, whether it's through a dripping system, right, or a sub irrigation or overhead irrigation, and then all the complexities of in the nursery industry choosing to irrigate in a sub irrigation system has consequences in terms of harvest, right? And the same is true of micro irrigation. We put all these drip emitters on our crops. When you go to harvest, it's a pain. You have to remove all the emitters. You have to stop them. You have to step through the spaghetti tubing, right, or all the connections. So there are consequences for wanting to be water efficient in that particular setting. And I feel like as we look at production in the industry, we've come so far, but in some cases we found something that worked, and now we move forward and we pay our bills, right? We make our profit where we're at. And what I'm seeing with climate change, with water shortage, with these pressures coming that are bigger than something that is small that you can think of in 1 year or in 1 month, we're being forced to consider some of these things. Supply chain interruptions, consumer awareness of issues where they boycott products or they change their mind about what they want to buy. Those things are forcing innovation and change, which is expanding our knowledge, which is really exciting.
What's been the biggest change you've seen over the past 20 years?
20 years. I believe one of the things that has changed for me personally was early in my time in the nursery industry, when you started looking at a substrate for growing plants, they were pretty basic, centered around peat and very often perlite. And now I see coir, being used to such extreme lengths, or core, depending upon who you're talking to. I see other forms of compost. I see really interesting substrates that are so different than what I worked with. And then stacking onto that is container technology, where we've gone from just the original old food containers being used as containers to now incredible technology with air pruning and root architecture being a major factor. Really cool to see that innovation.
When you look at in the nursery, there's a lot of things encompassed in a potting mix. You have water holding capacity, you have the inherent nutrients in that media, whether they're added or like compost is going to have some nutrients to it versus like seed mix with fertilizer added to it. You
Mhm.
have porosity, water holding capacity, you have organic matter content, and then you have the type of organic matter. When you start to lump all these different variables, they're all like little dials, right, that you can tweak to get the optimum mix. If you're thinking very broad, are there things we know now of if you're looking at a nursery mix, these are the things you wanna get right?
Mm. Yeah, that is a good question. I think some growers have had their paradigm changed a bit in this past year, and that is availability has risen to the top. It was always there, it always mattered. But for a long time, many growers I talked to, they could get what they wanted. If they wanted peat, they could get peat. If they wanted perlite, they could get perlite. And what we saw in the pandemic and even leading up to the pandemic were peat shortages and shortages of components that were formerly quite reliable. So I believe as you start looking at all those factors, the desire to have something that you can count on, that's going to be there the day you want to pot your crop, that's really, really important. Porosity, I believe, is really driving all this. You talk about that airspace, the space that's available for oxygen and for water and nutrient holding and I guess less nutrient holding, but root growth, so critical. And I think those things, cost is going to be a driver as you start asking. We can sub things out. We can look at water holding and we can say there are different components that can fill that niche. So when we look at soil, I enjoy teaching classes and talking to students about, well, what's different between a soil and a soilless substrate, right? Or an artificial media or artificial substrate. I like that term better because you can use soil in a soilless substrate, as a small component. And so as we look at an artificial substrate, how is it different? And you take a field, a nice field setting, as in like a landscape field, right? There are trees, there are shrubs, there are grasses, and you look at porosity and you're sitting at 50% or maybe a little bit under. Walk into a greenhouse where someone is growing a crop you're going to pick up at a garden center, and it's sitting at 80 to 95% porosity, just a different world compared to that natural field setting. And so our goal is to have this hyper productive production setting in a container. So porosity is a driver. We need it. It's got to be there, but we have to be able to find what we want. So as a teacher, as an instructor, my goal is to help my students know big picture principles that you talked about, all these things we can look at, organic matter and mineral-based matter. But when it comes down to is the chemical and physical properties, and then saying, how do I look at what's available to me? How do I find what is cost effective? And how do I put that together to have a high performing substrate for my crop?
So let's say the optimum porosity for a given thing we're growing is X. Is it more important about getting to X versus versus the makeup of materials that make X happen? So let's
Mm,
say you could just get X porosity using peat. Is that going to perform the same as if you mixed in perlite, vermiculite, peat, and compost and you were still at X?
that's a really good question as well. Part of this comes down to, if we're thinking about pore space and we want to hold water, we want to hold oxygen, we want root growth, we've got to understand that some of that pore space is going to fill up with water readily and hold it. Some is going to maintain oxygen. So the answer to your question would be, it's not all the same. We want some that is going to not hold water completely. You take a purely peat-based mix that has a good wetting agent or is very quick to hold water, and it will get really heavy and wet when you irrigate that substrate. You add in a little bit of perlite where it doesn't tend to hold on to water excessively. You're still going to have airspace oxygen for respiration after irrigation. Now, the thing that's interesting is you can have, quote unquote, the wrong substrate if you dial in your irrigation appropriately. So there are times where you might have a substrate, a grower will tell you that holds too much water, that will not grow a good crop. If you know what you're doing when you irrigate, you can probably work with it. You can make it work, but it might be very dangerous if you're exposed to rain or you can't control the amount of water carefully. So when we're talking about this porosity idea, yes, there would be this big difference between, will that substrate hold excessive amounts of water and become very saturated, very, very, very wet, or will it maintain some oxygen right after irrigation? And this is where oftentimes, you go into a garden center and they're selling you a mix designed for succulents or designed for certain water sensitive crops. It's going to have a lot of that porosity that's not going to hold excessive water. Whereas you take others, they're going to soak up water like a sponge and be incredibly heavy after irrigation.